So the company is called Naylor Games, and some people might think that's a bit conceited, calling my company just my surname, James Naylor, Naylor Games. But one of the things that I thought about branding from quite an early point in the kind of social media era in which we live in now, to get people to thinking about a product is already very challenging. To then ask them to think about who you are and remember who you are is like an extra challenge. And then if you then want them to think about third thing, the name of the publishing company, you're now expecting people to kind of hold three different identities in their head when they're thinking about you. And so I thought, well, let's simplify that for people. If it's Naylor Games, then kind of me and the company are a bit more synonymous. When you're thinking about your personal branding, which is often quite important, I think now when you're launching a business, that's one less thing that someone has to remember. So I think there's kind of benefit of a more old-fashioned classical education where you learn about everything, is that just knowing more about the world in general is kind of important for helping you solve problems. Sometimes we have a very skills-oriented view of education, which is just like, well, as long as you've got the right skills, you can know nothing about the world, have no curiosity, you'll be fine. Incorrect. I'm pretty sure that for really difficult problem solving, the whole reason that humans are great is because we are constantly taking information from very different fields or domains and then cross-pollinating that. And actually, a lot of really good ideas, they rarely come from the people who've just been in the industry all the way through, done the same thing, and are incurious. Even the people who've spent their entire lives in the industry and then innovate in it tend to be people with a huge amount of curiosity. Because where are you going to get the ideas from that are going to change things? They're not, by definition, going to be from within.
Hi, I'm your host Chris Matthews, and you're listening to the Mentor Collective podcast. Conversations that resonate, stories that inspire. In each episode, I'm joined by a guest. We explore their personal stories, the challenges and triumphs which have shaped them, and the invaluable lessons learned along the way. Join us as we navigate through 4 key themes: career journey and reflections, personal and holistic approach, leadership and values, and finally, mentorship, guiding and being guided. In each theme, we traverse the past, present, and future, unraveling the unique narratives of our guests. Welcome to the Mentor Collective podcast. James, thank you so much. It's so good to see you again. It's so great to have you on the Mentor Collective podcast. Thank you so much for coming and for joining.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I wonder if you can introduce yourself to the listeners and talk a little bit about yourself.
Yes, sure thing. So I'm James. I run a board game publishing business, although it's increasingly a board game publishing and logistics business, where we help other board game companies get their products all around the world. And I've been doing this for a little while. This is a startup that I launched in 2018, and I've been working on it since then. And pretty much full time since really 2021 to initially just to get out the board games that I wanted to make as a board game designer. I knew I'd always wanted to run my own business. And in fact, I'd done a few different ventures in the past. I used to run a community newspaper in Croydon. I ran a kind of marketing consulting firm for a little while. And I thought I wanted to just initially get a game that I'd always dreamed of making published. And this game was called Magnate, the First City. And it's a property themed game, a kind of contemporary Monopoly, if you will. And I thought, well, I want to start this business to at least get that published. But after I managed to get that published, I decided that actually I liked the whole enterprise of it. I really enjoyed the whole process end to end in making a board game. This, coming from where I was previously in technology, there's something really special about making a product that just is a kind of unalloyed good. When people play a game they're really enjoying, it brings a little moment of joy into their lives, and it's wonderful making a product like that. And that's not to say that it's not fulfilling in other ways to work in other industries where you are doing something that might be technically fascinating, like I was doing previously, that was intellectually stimulating. But this time, I guess I got to do something that I kind of was not only intellectually stimulating, but something I believed in as well. And I think that's where, that's been the kind of bit of a journey that I guess I've been on. That is why I ended up founding this business. And so the funny thing is that today I actually don't do as much game making as I would like to do, because we are now so busy on the kind of services side of our business, helping other game companies succeed, that I don't get to do so much in the way of game design anymore.
That's great. Thank you so much. And what is the name of your company, James?
Oh, right, yes, I should probably include that, shouldn't I?
That's all right.
Just to tell you, no, it's secret. You're not allowed to know.
You will never know.
It's important that it remains anonymous. No. So the company is called Naylor Games, and some people might think that's a bit conceited, calling my company just my surname, James Naylor, Naylor Games. But one of the things that I thought about branding from quite an early point in the kind of social media era in which we live in now is it's enough just to get a single identity of like a board game into people's minds, like a product. To get people just thinking about a product is already very challenging. To then ask them to think about who you are and remember who you are is like an extra challenge. And then if you then want them to think about a third thing, the name of the publishing company, you're now expecting people to kind of hold 3 different identities in their head when they're thinking about you. And so I thought, well, let's simplify that for people. If it's Naylor Games, then kind of me and the company are a bit more synonymous. And at least then in that kind of, when you're thinking about your personal branding, which is often quite important, I think now when you're launching a business, that's one less thing that someone has to remember. And so that's why the company is called Naylor Games. It's one less thing for people to remember.
That's great. And it makes a lot of sense, and it does not conceit at all. Thank you for sharing. Great. So I guess when you left school, you didn't just sort of go into hibernation until now and until very recently, and then start doing your board game. So I wonder if we now broached our first theme, which is career journey and reflections. So going right back to wherever you want to go back to, really, how did your journey begin and what led you to where you are today?
The first thing I want to say is I can confirm I wasn't put on ice for the last 17, 18, 20 years, I guess, and then just sort of recently unfrozen to deliver board games.
The lights came on in the big warehouse.
Exactly.
The fog came.
So no, absolutely not. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. So actually, I think where I am today is probably very much not where I think I would have predicted I would have been when I left school. So I left school and I then went on to a gap year. And that's because I really wanted to experience a little bit of life around the world before I went to university. And I ended up going to China, where I worked at a television station in China. And that's because at the time, the big thing I thought I would end up in as a job would be maybe film or television. And that's because I'd always been interested in films. I had loved writing screenplays, including feature-length screenplays that I wrote when I was sort of 16 or 17. And I thought, well, therefore, what I wanted to do is the film industry. I was also fascinated by kind of China as a kind of growing economy and just very interested to experience a very different place. So actually, the first thing I did was actually to go and live there for 3 months working in a Chinese TV station. And specifically, it was a hotel television station. So it was a business channel broadcast to hotel rooms in English, or at the very least, always with English subtitles on the Chinese content, because it was designed for more like international business travelers. And that was a fascinating experience. That was a really great way to kind of get out of the school bubble and see a place that was radically different. Still, probably one of the best trips of my life. Now, literally this year will be 20 years ago, which kind of blows my mind. Just thinking about that.
And that was a full year that you were away?
So actually, I was there about 3 months. Okay. So it was a fixed internship thing at this Chinese TV station where I learned a huge amount about. I think for me, one of the big surprises was about Chinese working culture, and it meant that in the sort of last 20 years, it's given me a bit more insight into some of that in a way that I think sometimes people in the West don't have. One of the assumptions is that they see like the incredible output historically in the last 20 years China has had, and they assume that it must be a very intensive working culture. But in fact, actually, it's a very extensive working culture. And what that means is that people don't actually work very hard, but they work for very long periods of time. And that is very different to the Western model where, generally the dream is that maybe you are clocking off at 4 or 5, right, after having intensely been highly productive for a short period of time, and then you go home and see your family. Whereas in the Chinese model, you're working 6 days a week. You generally get in the office maybe like 7 a.m. and then you're leaving at 7 p.m. Which sounds hellish to a Western mind until you realize that for a lot of white collar roles, particularly in China, and I can't speak to people who work in true working class jobs in China, but in the white collar world in China, you're actually often not very busy during the day. So, for example, it was quite common that some of the camera guys would come to us in the office and they'd say like, hey, do you want to come and play some football? Just at like 3 PM. And they'd just be out for a kick around just because they sort of felt like it, right? And they were, even in the CEO's office, he's got like 2 or 3 secretaries around him. You'd just be shopping. I saw someone playing Counter-Strike like while the CEO was right there, because it was sort of regarded that this was just part of the working culture. In fact, I initially also mistook the CEO for the repairman because he was like fixing desks.
That was the reason why it was a 3-month stint.
Yeah, so, well, the other thing about it though, is that actually when I spoke to people, this is kind of like often how it works. And the thing that they would say to us is that they'd always be amazed that we would just like do everything we possibly could during the work hours and then aim to go home early. To them, that was like, they in fact, the phrase that was sometimes used to me, actually several people as well, like outside of this office as well, they would say things to me like, oh, that's those hyper efficient Western working practices, right? They would actually use that phrase. I heard that phrase a couple of times from, you know, and I found it very interesting because to me it was like, I kind of think this is literally just how we are raised. I don't know that there's anything particularly special about this. And in some sense, this seems like this would be quite easy to replicate. But it was just fascinating seeing that so very different cultural assumptions. And it didn't make me think, oh, you know, people in the West are lazy and they're hardworking. I thought, no, I think both of these people are very hardworking, but they're just doing it in a very different way, where someone's prepared to be at work for a very long period of time, but they're getting the same amount of work done, but they're kind of having it in a slightly more relaxed manner versus the people who are not. That being said, I would kind of hate to think what like a high intensity office in China would be like, because I think if the expectation was from 7 to 7, that would be quite nightmarish. And interestingly, that's I think probably what some of the kind of let it rot and lying flat movements that are going on in China right now are about. The fact that probably they've tried to import those kind of like Western intense ways of doing things sometimes into the Chinese context, where actually that just breaks people. Like that's fundamentally not sustainable to a human being.
Yeah. Wow. So China was very formative in how you could work for you. And then what happened after China? Yeah,
I think China gave me like a very different perspective on how things could be done. And I think it just, even if you would not want to copy it, you just get a sense of like, actually a lot more of my experience is slightly more culturally defined than it first appears. And you see particularly even like modes of work, which we always think about as very economic, very pragmatic. And therefore, you know, that's something different. So after China, I came home and actually worked at a wine merchant. That was kind of next career experience. So I worked at a company called Laithwaite's, was selling wines to people. So a very radically different role. And actually, I actually came to absolutely love this job. This was a really, really great experience for me in terms of being in the world of work in Britain and doing things with sales, trying to work out, you know, working out when a customer comes in, trying to read them. Working out, well, what do they want? What questions can I ask without being too pushy, and I can kind of be polite to get them to find out from them the key information I need to sell them on what I need to sell them on. You know, it taught me about working with long-term clients as well, because we had customers who'd come in who'd be regulars, and they kind of wanted to be sold to, which was great in many ways. But also, it was very helpful because you could start legitimately finding things for them that you thought, I know this person's long-term taste. So I'm not just making guesses now what this person probably is looking for, but I really know their long-term taste. How can I get them what they need? And that was a great experience from the point of view of teaching sales. And I'm a huge believer in the more and more I go, the more important I actually think sales is. And for me, that's been a bit of adjustment, because I think I would have been the kind of person in the past who would believe that the most important thing you do is the quality of your product. And I think that's it. Product quality, if you have the best product quality and the best sales, you will win, for sure. But you can actually, the sad truth is, if you can sell really well, you can actually sell somewhat mediocre products. And I don't want to do that, but actually, if you recognize the reality of that, you don't maybe keep ignoring the importance of it. I think some entrepreneurs are naturally very sales focused because that's what they really enjoy most of all. So they love going into that environment and doing that. So they don't have to. Sort of that advice about sales being so vital is not kind of for them on some level, because they already, if anything, will be overcorrecting in that direction. But for me, that's been valuable. And there's a particular thing that maybe some of your listeners will be interested in, that Peter Thiel talks about quite a bit about this, which is about the idea that constantly in markets, people are trying to make sales seem less important than it is. So you don't call like someone who's like a high level salesperson who's building connections a salesperson. You call them business development, right? You don't call someone like a customer salesperson who's trying to help a customer deliver a project, but ultimately is selling them or maybe upselling them on benefits. You definitely call them customer success. You come up with terms to describe all this sort of thing for the simple reason that no one likes the idea that they're being sold to, even when they are. And then the problem with this becomes that you start thinking, because people publicly want to say, oh, we're not salespeople, we're just trying to deliver a great product, right? And they do this kind of, all this classical stuff, means that in the end, if you fall for that, you stop thinking that sales is really important because the people are saying it. But of course they're saying that sales isn't really important because no one wants to ever be thinking they're being sold to. And that creates a bias where quite like systems-minded entrepreneurs like me can end up in a bit of a dangerous position where they think that sales isn't as important as they think it is. And so I think an experience like doing lathe weights was great because also the product is not like I can come up to it with a very nerdily and say, here are the 15 features and benefits that precisely match your use case for this wine, right? It's not about that. It's a really emotive sell that's about like talking about a moment. It's about, what's the social context they're going to be using that wine in? What does it represent to them? When they tell you, oh, I love this wine, often it's because, maybe they really remember a good holiday where they really enjoyed it. Like, you're dealing in the world of emotional connections. And I think even if you're in like the kind of business that I'm in now, which is filled with people who hate sales and on the logistics side is very, very serious and detail orientated, the reality is that having that a bit of experience on that emotional side is great. And actually, after doing that, during my gap year, I actually went back pretty much every year during my summer at university as well, because that was something that I really loved that job. It was actually it was really fun work to do.
Wow. So we had the Chinese and the TV broadcasting. We had the wine, which became passion. The wine salesman became passion. So after lathe weights, what happened next until today?
Right. Okay. So obviously I went to university. I went to Oxford to study philosophy and theology, just because they're two subjects that always fascinated me from the point of view of that. And I actually thought, again, my earlier career was very much, I thought, again, more humanities related. I thought, film and TV, that's where I'm going to be. And I just thought, but, get a really good degree. For sure you want to get that because that will be generically useful kind of whatever happens. Maybe make some good connections while I'm at Oxford as well. I decided then, I enjoyed it so much, I wanted to stick around for another year. So I did a master's in film aesthetics, which at that time, before things got crazy expensive, actually, believe it or not, wasn't too crazy expensive as a graduate degree to do, which was good. And then spent the next extra year in Oxford, and then sort of realised that fourth year was like, that was my fill. I'm like, yeah, I've had enough of this. This place has been amazing, but it's time to move on. And so after that, I actually pretty much out of university went straight into founding my own business. And I started this marketing consulting firm, taking knowledge I had learned during university, where I had run University Film Society, and I'd been involved in organising and different activities. And I thought, well, I can use some of this knowledge. I know so much about this stuff. I'm an early adopter of social media. I can do this really, really well. And then spent the next, what would it be in total, 2 years of my life trying to make that work. And then realizing that I actually had zero experience, and coming to the uncomfortable realization that, I don't know jack shit about this. I don't know very much at all, and I have some fundamental skills and talent. Sure, some people I'm delivering some good stuff for, but I'm delivering good things to people pretty much accidentally, not because there's a really strong experience that I have. And coming to that conclusion at the kind of end of 2011. Was really tough. And I'd done some really fun things during that time. I'd set up this tour company of Croydon, where I was doing these Croydon walking tours and, on the idea that it's Britain's most interesting town, still something I strongly believe. What I also knew is that would be a bit of a red rag to a bull to people. People were already super beating up on Croydon.
I remember because you were on the news, right? You're on the BBC.
Well, yeah, exactly. So I was actually, it was this kind of thing that if you've never experienced it before, of getting major national coverage, it's super weird, because in the space of like 2 days, you'll suddenly be talking to loads of people. I was on the BBC News, I was on ITV News, I was interviewed by The Guardian, I was interviewed by the Sunday Times, I was interviewed by The Sun, all in the course of basically 2 days, just because of my kind of, my claim of like, I'm doing walking tours of Croydon because it's so fascinating. People are like, walking tours of Croydon, this is deranged. And of course, it's the classic news story, dog bites man isn't news, but man bites dog is news. So very much that became the kind of whole thing, and it exploded. And that was actually really good for me in terms of the experience of doing PR. That was in 2011, and it was a brilliant thing. But again, I actually then did turn that into a bit of a business, and I was doing every weekend for a little while after that, I was actually doing walking tours. And people were turning up and paying their money to just have a walking tour from me. And actually that was pretty cool. But to be honest, it was never going to be enough money to pay all my bills living off a walking tour. Probably not what I'd want to do long term as well. So while I was doing this marketing consulting thing, I sort of came to the conclusion, I think for me was a kind of a bit of a low for me, was the realization that didn't have an experience, and I needed to start kind of all over again in terms of my career. So I went to, and it was February 2012, I went to an internship agency in London called Inspiring Interns. And because I just thought to myself, James, you don't know anything. You have to start at the bottom. Once you go in again at the bottom, you can work your way up. You can work your way up. You don't need to, you just need to learn some things and have some experience working in companies. And the moment I arrived, they were doing my video. I've just done my video interview. I think they were one of the first people to like pioneer video CVs, and now they're often quite common. But this is 12 years ago now, basically. And immediately, the head of Inspiring Interns took me aside, and he said, I actually kind of don't want to give you out to anyone. Why don't you come and work for me? And so I was brought on as an intern for them in a product management capacity. Now, at this point, I had no idea what product management was. I'd never heard of it. If someone said you're a product manager, I'm like, I don't know what that person would do, how they do, like, what is that, basically? And I discovered very quickly what it involved, at least in technology. And that's because this company were trying to develop a piece of recruiting software based on their experience as a recruitment agency. And so I was teamed up with someone who then I worked with on a regular basis to then develop the software, a little team of people that I became part of. And over the kind of next sort of 4 to 6 months, I think, I learned a tremendous amount and sort of discovered this whole product management thing where you are responsible for conceiving of how a product will come together and then deliver value for customers, for being the kind of CEO of the product, managing the whole thing. I thought, oh my God, I love this. This is kind of the closest thing to being an entrepreneur that you can be inside a larger organization. And so this fits me really well. I'm thinking about the product in the round. I'm thinking about finance. I'm thinking about market. I'm thinking about user experience, design, function. You're bringing all that stuff together and getting the chance to design it. And so that was a brilliant start, and it kind of showed me that there was a role in businesses for me where I could be a bit entrepreneurial and I would be rewarded for that. So I worked at this Inspiring Interns for a little while. Then in the middle of 2012, I moved to, I decided to get a full-time job. The things that I think they were sort of deciding they weren't sure if they were going to keep pushing the software forward. I think it's always super challenging, because it's something we're kind of very much cognizant of now, is that if you are running an active service business and you're trying to build a technology business on top of a service business, that can be very challenging, because you're rushing to keep your clients happy, but you're also trying to make strategic investments in automation, which is something that's a big problem we face today. And I think the explosion of things like no-code tools and stuff has enabled us to do that much more efficiently if we think about the present. But back then, it was really hard to deliver that. Even 12 years ago, that was a real challenge, because the tech for building things just wasn't there in the same way it is today. So I worked on this, and eventually, as a result, I thought, well, I need to look for a new job. Where am I going to go? And I applied for a job at a company called Exponential, which was a online advertising company. And I went to the interview at Exponential. I was asked some classic interview questions. I got one which I still occasionally like, if I can find an excuse to use, I like to use, which is to just ask people to work out. You just say to someone, without referencing any information or looking anything up, how many washing machines are sold in the UK every year? It's quite a clever test because some people go, oh, I'll look it up, I would ask you, or I would find out. And it's like, no, none of these are the right answer. My instinct was to immediately say, right, okay, so there's approximately this number of people, there's approximately this number of households, there are a washing machine, they probably have this amount of market penetration for washing machines, and then an average lifespan is this, they get replaced after this, some are never replaced. You work out the numbers, and I said, I think it's 2.5 million washing machines that are sold every year or something like that. And then he said, well, it's actually 2.2, so is the real number. So actually, this is pretty good. And of course, really what it is, it's a classic thing where it's a demonstration of your ability to think about all the aspects of a problem and try to work backwards from what information you do have to infer what you can with your limited resources. And I'm very glad to say, came out of that interview and I had got the job immediately. I found out 20 minutes off the call I'd got it, and I was so grateful. I was just my first kind of proper London job where I was no longer just an intern. I was now paid, at the time particularly, a pretty good salary really to do this sort of interesting product thing where I would get to think about how we could drive a product forward. And to be honest, I had a brilliant time there. I was there for the next 2 years, and it was actually a really good company. We had some really, really great leadership. My boss there, Doug Connolly, was a really smart guy who was just so good to learn from. He was always up for mentoring as well, which I think was something that's really important. And I was there for 2 years. And I learned a huge amount more about technology. In fact, probably maybe the second biggest career learning exercise, I guess, happened there, because I had to learn. I guess that was the first time, which I think is true for lots of people who've. I was probably coming to this later than lots of people, but your first white collar professional job, where there's just all the basic skills. At the beginning, you're just completely clueless. Like people are explaining to you things like, this is how a calendar works in Outlook so that you can book people's time, right? And that kind of stuff, right? And you feel like, and when you realize there are just basic ways of doing things, you haven't been doing them, and you feel like such a klutz. But you're learning all this very basic stuff about how teams work, about how companies work, about how company etiquette works, about you start learning not just about, you kind of know about what management is going in, but you don't really know what like managing up is and things like that, where you start to learn these other nuanced workplace skills. And so I got to learn a tremendous amount of technology from a really good team in general. I had some great, Doug Connolly there, Tim Sleeth, he was another great manager I had there, some really solid people that I got to work with, and learn a huge amount of online advertising, which itself was a fascinating industry because it's one where technology has been used at such incredible scale. I mean, particularly through real-time bidding technology, where someone's taking up to a page and then 50 milliseconds, their right to show them an ad is auctioned. Multiple people then decide on that, whether they want to place bids, and then that sale completes and delivers up an ad that's probably these days will be personalized to them as well. All happening as tiny fraction of a second. But the technology is like intellectually fascinating to work with. And so particularly I got to work on the insight side of things, where you look at kind of long-term behavioral stuff about people's long-term behaviors and what predicts people buying different items online, basically. And so that was great from a marketing perspective as well, because suddenly you had these tools that, to be honest, when I showed people, they'd just love it. They'd just look at it and go, oh my God, you mean we can find out this about people? I'm like, yeah, there's a huge amount we can say using this kind of software, processing, billions and billions of rows of data. So it was a great experience, and one that I found was probably the most important 2 years from the point of view of kind of career footing, I think.
And then I know there was quite a large overlap, right, between you and the world of permanent work and Naylor Games setting up, maybe didn't even have a name at the time. What was the kind of the switch moment from you being James Naylor, the permanent employee, to James Naylor, the head of Naylor Games?
So that's really interesting. So so in the same way that the tours were running alongside the marketing company, I've always generally got two things going on historically. I think that's something I've realized, which I think can be a blessing and a curse. So I was also in 2012, this is the year that I joined Exponential, I also launched a newspaper. So we launched the Croydon Citizen, which was this online newspaper, and then by the beginning of 2014, a print newspaper in which we were basically publishing a kind of magazine opinion kind of content for Croydon, where I live. And so that was a brilliant experience from the point of view of getting a team of people together, and then you've got a small part-time team of editors, but then you need to work out how you wrangle like 100 writers to consistently produce content. And so that was a fantastic experience where I was, as before at the marketing agency, I was running a budget, but this time I had a lot more insight into things, around the ideas of core business financial concepts, about your gross margin and your net margin, your overheads, understanding the financial side, being completely responsible for this thing staying alive, and it paying some people, and then working out how you solve that problem, right? Of how you make sure you pay the right level of salary, this kind of thing. And that was a fascinating experience having that alongside it. I think something before I get to Naylor Games, I want to talk about one more thing that I think is really, really important. And that's probably the most important part of my professional career prior to Naylor Games, which is hybrid theory, as it is now known. Back then, I believe it was called Effect.tv, which was the company I moved to in 2014, which is almost 10 years ago now. Crazy to think about it, from Exponential after 2 solid years there. That job was another product management job in online advertising, a much smaller, scrappier startup where I had a lot more direct engagement with the CEO and the founders of the business. And it was really important because it was fascinating being exposed to the way that in startups there's like always a million more things to do than you can possibly do. And beginning to learn that experience of how you deal with that. In the corporate world, Exponential was already an 800-person company. It felt like a big company. It no longer felt like a small business. And seeing that radical difference when you've got 50 headcount of just how much more, even at that point, even at 50, how frenzied everything was. And it was also really important because, to be honest, that company, through various combinations, I think some not always great strategic choices, but also some bad luck, ended up in some trouble. And they ended up losing basically their entire engineering team. Now, I was at the peak, that engineering and product team was about 20 people. And I was part of that team. And I was basically given the opportunity to take command of that team. And I thought, well, given the company is so screwed, what some people might decide to do in this moment is go, well, be the rat fleeing the sinking ship. I'm going to go because, to be honest, this thing is screwed. But then the other, they were saying to me, look, we're going to make you director of everything. And are you up for that? And I said, hot damn, I'm up for that. And so I became in charge. And actually it was really great because then we actually got to massively expand the team. And so from pretty much 2016, when things were end of 2015, when things were really having a lot of difficulty, through to 2018, I got to run that team completely and rebuild all of our rebuild a lot of our technology and rebuild that team up to about 10 headcount. And so that was an amazing experience because suddenly I was getting to experience the C-suite level job of having to rebuild an engineering team from scratch. And I had some great support. They brought on a consultant who was in the first 2 months, who was a brilliant guy I was still in touch with, who's fantastic at this kind of relaunch thing. He helped me out. And then we grew the team back up to 10 or so people. And we became, I'm very glad to say, by the time that I left, the lowest, or rather the highest retention rate team in the company. So we were managing to, we basically had an average of about, basically at the point I left, no one else had left that team. And there was a whole kind of strong band of brothers kind of vibe to the whole thing, and including people who'd been there in the years before. One of them had been the years before I had been there as well. And so I think it was a wonderful experience in terms of just when you're up against it as a group, you're banded together, and it gave me so much opportunity to learn so much. I got to run the entire budget for everything to do with the technical side of the business, set the strategy, set the product roadmap. And I had to learn so much about machine learning and about large scale big data systems and scaled engineering problems that, to be honest, I mean, we were processing something like 20 billion rows of data a month. So you needed this was not off the shelf stuff you can do in a home cooked database or no code tool. And it basically gave me, I think, the skill that we're going to need today in order to kind of complete the technology transition of Naylor Games. That was I want to mention that one because that really was perhaps the most formative important career experience I think I probably had. And that's why I would strongly endorse to anyone, a crisis is not a bad thing, because if you can learn to thrive through that, you'll learn so much.
I guess when you look back, you've mentioned that you've had one or two mentors, and maybe not in a kind of overt way, but there have been people that have really guided and shaped you. Did you ever come across or did anyone ever give you any particular advice, or was there any particular moment or moments in your whole, I don't know whether it's a career really, because you've gone from many things to, I guess, the final piece of marketing and then into your own business. But so across all of that, were there any standout moments, any key kind of pieces of advice that really stick with you?
It's a very interesting question. I think generally not. And for the simple reason that if you are engaged in learning from a lot of really talented people, those things are coming at you so thick and fast that it becomes, if you're listening out for them, if you're listening for what people are telling you that's really valuable, there will often be so many of those experiences that actually, like, what I come away with it more is thinking more about broadly what particular people have taught me. So, for example, I think Doug, I found at Exponential, taught me a lot about the value of being quite pragmatic. He would be very realistic. He would always give us the most sober take on it. It really was like he had a very limited level of filter, and he would sometimes just say things that were a little bit, if anything, on the inappropriate end from the point of view of just being brutally honest about where the business is. That I found often quite funny, but also hugely informative. And it made me think increasingly that taught me that the idea that I think in leadership, you do want to be as honest with people as possible. Now, there are things that strategically you're going to have to project a certain way. And I would say later on in my career, the thing that I realized, in particularly working at Hybrid Theory, is once I was really close to power, I had this problem of when I had to push something through that I knew people wouldn't like, and you start acting as a go-between between the rest of the C-suite and the engineers, for example. And at this point, this truly is an exercise in diplomacy that has to be very, very carefully managed, and you have to be a bit careful what you say. And that's just sort of like the fallen nature of reality, that you can't be completely honest. But I think people underrate how honest they can be. Because if you give people something authentically honest, you just present the positive elements of it honestly, right? So it's not spin. You're not telling people, oh, don't worry, this thing's going to be fine. You go, no, this is going to be crap. But actually, as well as it's going to be crap, what we're about to go through as an experience, we're going to have to do something that we're technically not proud of. But on the other hand, we're going to, there's some great opportunity here. We're finally bought ourselves the leverage we need to fix something else. We're finally going to get rid of this key piece of technology that's been our bane, and that we're going to focus on eliminating because it was, badly constructed thing that we can replace with something better. And that it's about focusing on the positives of what there is to do, or that it will be itself technically fascinating. And I know that the team itself will be able to bandy around it and deliver it. And I think so. I found his honesty, particularly Doug's honesty, I found particularly useful. And his general no bullshit attitude to things, and being quite realistic about the corporate realities of how the business had to operate, and being quite honest with us about them, just saying, look, this is how things are, this is why they are the way they are, and we have to work within those limits. And I think that's important, because otherwise you can get bosses who either do this thing where it's like, oh, I'm going to be on the side of management because I know what side my bread is buttered, and I will just knife any of my employees wherever possible, which means you get no trust whatsoever. Or they think of themselves as amateur revolutionaries, and or you just go, well, they're just completely two-faced, and they say one thing to them saying, yeah, I agree, they're all terrible, we're totally going to do something about this, and then meanwhile they're in the meeting saying, God, those stupid engineers, don't worry, I'll tell them what a bunch of what a bunch of autistic weirdos they are, yeah, and then say all kinds of horrible shit, basically in a meeting in management. And it's disastrous, because eventually people are, A, they're going to hear you either one, and so it's a really bad idea from that perspective. But B, I think is it cheapens your moral authority as well, because whenever they find out that, piece by piece, they'll work out, oh yeah, he lied about this, he lied about that, he lied about this. You in the end, they lose trust for you. And, no surprise, I saw in other places, lots of turnover because of that.
One of the things that really struck me, I don't know when or where or who said it, but it was the idea that the more you lie about, the more there is for you to remember that you've lied about something. So like you sort of build and build. So and it happens all the time. Well, not all the time, thankfully, but it does happen in the workplace where people have fabricated their image to one set of people and then fabricated either a completely different or a slightly different version to another set of people. And the amount of energy that has to go into maintaining both sides or even the same to everyone else, the same persona, which is completely different to their authentic self. And I love that you say authentic. And I've spoken to almost every single person I've spoken to has talked about the value of authenticity in a slightly different frame. I love how you're describing it as a vehicle for gaining trust and for gaining respect, but it being a kind of noble thing, and not being you're being authentic because it's just the way it should be.
Yeah,
there is no other way. Just be true. But I really also liked what you said about thinking strategically about it, because you don't always need to be, what do they say? Like, you don't cut your nose to spite your face or something like that. We don't get into that. The whole time that I've known you, I have never thought about you as an artist. I've never thought about you as an artist. but you are an artist. You are an artist, right? And this is what I've just realized, because you were like going through your young adult life and you wanted to be a director. You wanted to work in film at least. And that is being an artist, right? And then you came out of that and then you were creating and it's almost like the creative energy that you had as a youth turned into how can I both be creative and also but produce something a little bit different, like a newspaper in Croydon, like a Croydon walking tour, and kind of there's a lot of creativity in your brain, and then you kind of went into corporate creativity where you were building with a team of people solutions to business problems, and so you're really heavily using your creativity. And now you are in this like almost post-creative state where you have your own company, which was the vehicle to putting out your art, which is your board game, and it's also very technical and beautiful, and love it. And I was like one of the first people to receive the game, and I love it, and it's upstairs.
Oh, right, thank you so much.
But what really struck me is that you said, I don't do much board game development anymore. It's more like logistics and things like that.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I'm talking to James the artist now.
Yeah.
Are you bothered that you realized this dream with Magnate? Because I know you had that for a really long time, right? And there was a lot of testing to make it the amazing game that it is now. And I'm not just saying that because you're here. It's a lot of work that's gone into it to be where it is today. It was a lot of work, yeah. And many years, right? And playtesting. And that
I think I started 2011. So it was almost exactly 10 years from the very first time I had the idea for it to it being this physical released game product you could buy in stores.
Gosh, and it shows, and it's so well reviewed and all this great stuff. But now you're like in the back office, like with the dusty books and things like that, and all the cool kids are doing all the art somewhere else and doing all the board games and so that's at least what I perceive. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond to that properly. But I think what I'm really interested to know is, are you at all bothered that your art has become reality and you found yourself more in the kind of corporate business leadership kind of frame than the constant artist producing?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question. So I think in many ways my relationship to making art has changed quite a bit. So I think originally I was always just compelled to be making things all of the time. And the relationship I've always had to all forms of art is that if I really enjoy a medium, then I want to create in that medium. So films, I love films, I should be a filmmaker. I love board games, I should make board games. Right? That is something that I think is I think it's quite a common thing to have, and I think is very much was my sense of it. And I actually firmly believe that probably everybody, or certainly every creative person, absolutely needs to have some kind of creative outlet like that. But I think two things have changed for me. So one, I think during my more corporate career, I found that some of what we were doing did actually satisfy those creative urges. So the product management was partly satisfying me because it was a job where at the end of it, you've built a piece of software. Now, maybe that's on an advertising system that's technically impressive. It's not going to brighten anyone's day, to be honest, but it is something that's technically impressive. That you still feel like you've produced, you've created, something from you has come into reality. And so I started finding that increasingly the other things that were not directly games at Naylor Games were of a great interest to me. It's often, one of my colleagues, Jaya, when we're in the office, he will be quite amused when I jump for joy when I've just built something in our order management system. It's a piece of software that processes orders and then automatically sends them to different hubs around the world. I'm just like, yes, God damn it, yes! I'm like punching the air when it works. And for him, it's like, as someone who's very intensely creative in games specifically and loves games more than I do, is just purely dedicated to them. It's quite odd for him to understand how someone could, over a spreadsheet formula or a script or over a Python script or something, could get that excited by it. And I think but actually for me, it actually does satisfy a lot of those creative urges. And I think, and the other thing I realized is that if we think of the kind of more classically the artistic side of the creativity, which is the one bit it doesn't satisfy, is that artistic sense, is that I kind of have accepted that probably me personally, I'm not going to be one of the truly great artists who sort of needs to be doing art and people should pay me so that I can live off art, right? Because the thing about it is that actually ultimately no one is owed a career in art. At the end of the day, my view is if you have the special thing that lots of people connect with, that's great. But that it either is that way or it's not. And Magnate is brilliant. It's been very successful. But, in commercial terms, if I think about board games, it's still not sold like the kind of massive volumes. I mean, board games are subject to like everything these days, are subject to an extreme Pareto distribution, where a small number of games account for the vast majority of the sales. I mean, something like Ticket to Ride has sold 10 million units globally. So I won't say the exact number of the Magnate print run.
I was waiting.
But I can tell you it's a lot less than
9 million.
than a million units. And it's certainly less than 100,000 units. So I think part of the problem is that, and actually in reality in board games, if you want to live off it as an artist in board games, you actually have to have games that are at least in the 100,000 unit sales up at the bare minimum and have lots of them. And I think the reality is that probably it wasn't on the cards for me to be one of those designers. I also began to dislike the process more because I realized that the bit about the board game creative process that I loved the most was development, not design. Now, this is a kind of subtle point that I will mention about the way that the board game industry works. Typically, what designers do is that they come up with the initial concept, and then they do the prototype, they make everything, they come up with all the game, they make the game basically work. At that point, the game gets handed over to developers whose job it is to take it from good to great. And something I realized was that all my favorite bits of the process were in the good to great part of the process. They were actually, there would be like 2% inspiration at the beginning, which would be wonderful on a new game. And I occasionally come up with a new game project and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so excited. And then there's this cavern, or the cavernous gulf, as a possible way to think about it. This kind of canyon is perhaps the best way to put it. Between the next bit I enjoy, which is the good to great bit, and the initial inspiration. And I actually realized that generally, that middle bit, I don't like very much. I find it stressful. I don't enjoy it that tremendously. And actually, instead what I get to do now is I get to empower other people to be creative. And actually, that's also really satisfying. That's something increasingly I empower other people to be artists. And so I think for me, that doesn't mean I won't make a game again. And I would love it if I could actually have some time to make a game again. But now for me, it's the basis of weighing up the excitement of, well, we've got so much opportunity to expand this business. I'm now weighing up time to go away and work on a game design versus time to grow the business. And to be honest, at the moment, it's the siren call of growing the business that's much stronger for me than the siren call of making a new game.
The chasm, as you described it, between sort of having that idea and then designing it, I guess the outcome of the design is the thing that you play, right? It's the physical.
Yeah, it would be once you've got a playable game that isn't just trash. And that's really easy to make trash.
There's a part of me that empathizes with that because, like you, I am also an only child. And I think that maybe it's a common trait of only children that there is a kind of control need to some extent.
Oh, that's interesting.
You know, that we are used to doing everything on our own. You know, on our own is just the default because that's all we've known apart from help from mum and dad who are nothing like us until we get to adults, and even then maybe not. So I wondered how much of your, I could ask it in two ways really, how much of that chasm is there because you're an only child, maybe you have you have high control needs, much like I do, because I don't like, if I've got an idea, I'd love to just push it all the way through to the end. How much of it is that versus whatever else it might be, if you think it's not that?
It's funny, I kind of feel like, while I think that might be true, and I certainly think the idea of being default thinking I need to approach everything alone, completely. I think that is a default thing that only children have. And I think then that itself naturally leads to some desire for perhaps more above control, as it were, versus the otherwise similar person with siblings, if you see what I mean. Because I think probably other personality aspects are more important as regards the need for control than this one, but I feel like it's definitely an influence. The funny thing about that is that increasing on the development end, I'm mostly just bouncing ideas off other people's products. You know, they come to me and then they go, what do you think of this thing? And I'm like, well, you can improve it like this. Have you considered this? Have you considered that? And then they go off and they take it the rest of the way on their own, in their own journey. And actually, I'm guiding them, but I'm actually not the one who, it's not my baby that I'm developing. Often my favorite development jobs when I'm working on things are when they're not mine. Because then I just get to input into someone else's thing, have some fun with it. I don't have the terrible responsibility of making it excellent. And I think actually the really good artists, in my experience, and I know from working or seeing how some of the board game creators work, the really good board game designers, they have a high degree of responsibility to believe the thing needs to be excellent. And so I think that's why, I think for me, it's just that middle part of the process has become so relatively high friction for me versus the joy of just expanding the business, that it's just that's the greater interest at the moment. So
the way that you have described your journey in the working world, I suppose I should call it that, you do it with such enthusiasm, almost like as you describe it to us and you're looking back, you have a very, very fond memories of what you did. I wonder, there's a kind of two-part question, really. One is around fulfillment. So it sounds to me like as you've gone through your post-education life, and actually even during education in Oxford, you were talking about how you really loved it and enjoyed it, that the way that you're describing everything that happened makes me feel like you experienced a lot of fulfillment wherever you were. Do you think, so the two-parter is, looking back now, do you think that you were fulfilled at that time? And the second part is, if you were to actually go back and ask yourself at that time, are you fulfilled yet? Do you think you'd hear a James Naylor that's like, no, I won't be fulfilled until my game is released, or no, I won't be fulfilled until X, Y, Z?
Well, really interesting question. So I tend to think it's a bit of a virtue to have a memory for the positive parts of the past, because I think it makes it much easier to be happy if you sort of selectively remember the good bits. So I think that would certainly be true, that for sure, if you were to go back in time, would there be loads of times where I could meet previous me, and previous me would actually have been quite unhappy in that job role? For sure, that would have happened. But on the other hand, I would say that actually overall previous me, even then, was pretty happy. I think I'm someone who has a pretty good default for enthusiasm and seeing the bright side. And so, and the situations in which I was unfulfilled were generally towards the end of those roles. So, for example, Exponential, well, why did I go? I left because in that role, not because there wasn't an opportunity there anymore for me, from the point of view of they desperately wanted to keep me, but I just felt like, well, this had run its course, and you'd started to get that position where you start seeing the same corporate patterns again and again and again. You realise that maybe the company's not really going anywhere. And I'm like, well, if the company's not going anywhere, and it seems like it's run by a guy who, by the way, incredibly talented, the guy Dilip De Silva who ran Exponential, super smart guy. But ultimately, he had a very particular vision, quite a stranglehold on the business, and it didn't have any compelling vision of how it was going to continue to prosper in a world dominated by Google, Facebook, and Amazon. And so I was like, right, well then, in which case, then I want something more exciting. And so I looked for that next role. And then similarly, the reason I left there was because I'd sort of felt like in 2018, 6 years, more than 6 years after I had, or about 6 years after I had gone back to the bottom, I felt like, well, I've actually gone from intern to head of technology at a software company in 6 years. I think that's pretty good. And I feel like I've now done my time a bit. I've actually gone away and done something. I've had the experience. I've had to climb the ladder. I've had to learn a lot of things. And I'm sure I could learn more, but probably realistically, it's like any kind of, is asymptotic, I think is the technical term for a graph like this, where it never reaches the top. Because it's growing and growing and growing, but the rate at which you're getting to close is halving constantly, so you never reach the end. I think career experience is a bit like that. You could theoretically learn even more, but is it still paying off? And the reason I left was because in 2017, by the end of 2017 at that company, I had begun to feel like I really wanted to go back to running my own business. In the same way that I'd been running the Citizen throughout that entire 6-year time period. I had done that before. I knew I had to be an entrepreneur. And sometimes when I look back now, when, we've been through tough times sometimes at Naylor Games, and I've looked back and I've gone, oh God, maybe I should have just stayed in the corporate world. I would have been on like a £200,000 a year chief product officer at a big company role by now. And money would be easy. And whenever I talk to Dad about it, he always just told me, no, don't you remember like what it was like in the last year, where you were constantly had these itchy feet because you were like, I hate having someone who's a boss. Ultimately, I want to do my own thing. It's not an option for me. It was never on the cards for me to stay in that role, realistically. If I had done it, would have been a knowing choice to be like, right, I'm going to make the super safe choice and I'm going to make the comfortable choice, but I know I'm going to have like low-level background misery. That would have been, and actually that's the sort of thing that I think people make all the time. And if you've got a really good reason for it, like you're supporting a family, you want to put your children through different kinds of education, you've got a big family support or something, you have that responsibility, that's different because now you're making a sacrifice for something else that's meaningful. As a single guy at that point, I would just be doing it for comfort, for physical comfort, not for fulfillment. So I would say I was fulfilled, I had some fulfilling experiences, but in each one of those cases, I knew, right, well, actually now the jig is up. Probably at this point, I've had the fulfillment I'm going to get from this particular role, and it's time to move on. And particularly with Hybrid Theory, because I felt they gave me such a good opportunity, I didn't want to just shake the dust off my feet and walk away completely. So I actually continued working with them on a contract basis for the first couple of years of 2-3 years of Naylor Games, because I wanted to do part-time work with them because I could recognize they were having some challenges. Ultimately, they actually sold the business now, and they got a good sum for it. They did really well, so I'm really glad to see they kind of landed the plane finally, which was wonderful. But so I felt I owed them that a bit, but at the same time, it was time for me to get going and start doing it.
Let's move on to the next theme, which is personal and holistic approach. So, I'm not going to ask you any stock questions, James, because there's just been so much that I can draw from that I'm just going to draw straight from the well, not from the bottles of water set behind me. So, the first thing I'd like to understand is that you seem to have this entrepreneurial spirit about you, right? And everything that you've done has been to get to the sharp end of the spear, right? Like everywhere you've been, when you've been an employee and now you're working for yourself, or you lead a company, your own company, there's always been this aspiration to get there. One theme that comes up very frequently in these podcasts is, and I think you've alluded to it a couple of times with was it Doug? I think when your boss Doug, is that when we think about mentors, we sometimes think about people very purposefully opening doors for someone else and saying things that change things and change things for people. But what happens, and through the course of these discussions that I've discovered with people, is that actually a majority of influence and inspiration comes from seeing someone in leadership do something that you thought prior to that wasn't possible. So in a similar way to Doug being just very open, transparent about the business and it's just not doing very well, that might have been the first time, or it sounds like anyway, it was the first time you'd heard anyone not just sugarcoat everything, which would be the, I guess, and I hope you don't mind me saying, like the kind of naive view of what leaders should be doing, right? To always just keep on pulling.
I can I just respond to that straight away by just saying, yes, I completely agree. And I think it was the first time very specifically, he wasn't sugarcoating it and he was giving the full strategic context. Like he was like, oh, this is why they're doing this and this, and it's not very good and I didn't agree with it, but this is actually, it all makes sense if you look at it from this perspective. And whereas before I had managers in previous environments where they'd be honest, but they'd kind of just be chippy about it. They'd just be like, oh yeah, those people upstairs have said this, right? With no idea of the idea that actually, because they kind of want to be on our side, without any idea that, like, actually, there are some really good reasons for this. And he's communicating that as well. It's not, he's actually giving us not the emotional, I want to be on your side, so I'm going to say whatever that makes it sound like we're the rebels together or something like that. He's giving me the most unvarnished, honest take that's kind of possible because he's sort of taking himself out of it.
So I wonder, when we then think about to the entrepreneurial spirit side of things and bringing those two things together, where do you think that comes from? Do you think that comes from having seen someone or people behaving in that way and doing well? Or where does that come from as far as you're concerned?
So I think there's a few inputs there. So one thing would be that I am very, very self-directed. So there's always some purpose that I'm wanting to move towards in some way or other. And so it seems very natural to me, therefore, to just keep setting your own direction. And if you keep setting your own direction, it's harder to be a follower. Because all the time you're like, well, let's go out and set out in this way. I mean, all the bosses I had that I really liked, I actually been very lucky. I had a lot of really good bosses with slightly different mentalities or experiences. I had, for example, Ray at Hybrid Theory, really smart guy, super interesting. He taught me a lot more about being just so curious about the market in general. He was like always, finding out what competitors were doing, exploring things, throwing in lots of lovely new ideas, not afraid to admit he's wrong, wanted to really, get that very excitable from that perspective, for example. And all the good bosses eventually realized all the time that the best way to manage me was like, right, James, here's your big North Star. You have to hit that, but I'm just going to leave you alone. And then I'd be like, yes, Captain. And then I would go ahead and I would just deliver all of that as much as I possibly could. Because I don't want to be micromanaged. I don't really want to be that much hands-on managed. I just want a bit of input, a bit of steering every so often. And I could just occasionally, the wonderful thing, particularly with later bosses, I had like Patrick at Hybrid Theory, who was the final CEO of Hybrid Theory before it sold out to, I can't remember what the company is, but a really big online advertising company. He would very much, treat me with that like that, and would just take the opportunity that we did speak to actually really just be very helpful in terms of genuinely mentoring me and helping me understand more about how different kinds of markets worked, or how, particularly him coming from a CFO background originally, how corporate finance worked, which was great. Like learning a lot more about how that operated was so useful. And so I know that having a big target to hit and then just going for it is how I like to operate. And so realistically, well, if when I've had good bosses who've mostly left me alone to do that, and I still want to be more self-directed, then at that point, you just know that that's how you're wired. And on some level, it's not a choice, because it would be again, it would only be worth going against that nature if I had a really good reason for doing it. And in some ways, even if that means making less money overall, it sort of doesn't matter because I kind of have to do this. I don't really have a choice. I think probably one of the influences on that is also my upbringing, because the only child thing is interesting. In particularly, my dad, of course, ran his own business as well and still does run his own business. So as a result, I kind of had the positive example of that from childhood quite well, that it was stressful, and I knew it was going to be stressful because at times he'd get really quite stressed. But he was also still able to be there as an incredible dad who also seemed to enjoy what he did. And he got a lot of pleasure out of running his own business. And so seeing that example made me think, yeah, of course I can do that. Easy, straightforward. In fact, if anything, it made going and running your own business obviously more of a background default for me than it would be for other people. So I think when you add all of these things together, it's like, well, you can't tell me what to do easily because I just get rebellious instantly. You have a very positive entrepreneurial role model in my dad, and I'm naturally super self-directed. I mean, come on, like in the end, it sort of has to go this way. There's not really a sense of it being different, unless something had happened in my life that would mean that it needed to go in a radically different direction.
And I think what's lovely, because you have a product, right? And everyone's trying to find a product to sell and to create and sell. But your product is the result of art and passion, rather than just I've spotted something that would sell, and then just going out to do it. So you're kind of you're covering all the bases, which is just such a lovely thing to hear. Gear shift. Are you ready?
I can gear shift.
Here we go. China. You mentioned, which would sound like an odd gear shift if you hadn't been listening to the whole podcast. So China, you mentioned about their way of working, and you spoke about it in the frame of it was long hours, but it was less intense. Has any of that way of working influenced you now?
It's really interesting you say that, because I'm kind of reaching the point where accidentally that is happening, or has happened for the past year. So we've had a very interesting year. This particularly for Naylor Games has been a very, let's call it interesting 18 months. And that's because if we go back pretty much exactly 18 months, we go back to our first ever back office client. So we basically have two sides of this business: the studio side of the business and the back office side. The studio side makes our game products and manages game products in general. The back office side is doing all of the global logistics, tax, product safety consulting, every one of the boring jobs you can imagine in board games, with the goal of building out basically a business platform. So the idea is that you could launch any kind of physical product and you could just like click your fingers and like spin up the operational side of your business as software. That's kind of the long-term vision of that. So we have those kind of those two sides to it. 18 months ago, we were on our first ever back office client, and we were literally just doing some stuff to do with convention logistics for them. And then today we have about 25 clients, and several of them are companies that are doing $500,000 Kickstarter campaigns. So and so far I have done essentially zero marketing doing this, because we've made something that's a very, very compelling value proposition. And you can imagine, however, the cost of this period has been to take a business from zero to this, where you're just getting constant inbounds, is exciting and thrilling. But we've also purchased in that time period 2 companies. And we have had to, one of those purchases was quite complicated from a legal perspective to manage. And released in the same time period, or at least put on Kickstarter another game product and developed 3 others. We're a very small team. So that was incredibly stressful. And what I noticed is I have been working more like in the Chinese mode, as it were. So I end up working long hours because there's just a minimum amount of work that needs to be done. And that thing about what entrepreneurs talk about being in the office from morning to night, has become my life now in many ways, in a way that I think in every other endeavor, I don't think it had. And I think it's one of those things where for me, it's changed my opinion on that in general. Like, I think I might have thought, look, if you just work really smart, that's all you need to do. I just think, at least for some kinds of business, maybe even most kinds of business, sometimes if you're growing something that's a difficult problem that you're trying to solve, you're just going to have to work exceptionally hard. And in some point, intense work doesn't cut it. Because there are just days when you're dealing with multiple client requests. There's just more to be done than you can afford in your 9-to-5 work schedule. So you just keep spilling over. But then I think what happens next is the more you do that, eventually you start burning out. And so what happens is you just inevitably get pushed into the Chinese work mode, because you are at that point working extensively, because you need to carry on. You can no longer put in the energy to do an intense burst because you're so goddamn tired. So instead, it just grows into this extensive work schedule. And it's something, to be honest, in the last few months, I've had to kind of actively work out of combat. Because if I want to do other things, like staying fit and healthy, cooking or anything like that, basic stuff, it's not compatible with getting into the office at 7 a.m. and leaving at 9. But to be clear, 9 p.m., not 9 a.m. That would be a real easy work day.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on those things. I wonder if let's move on to the third theme now, which is leadership and values. You mentioned earlier how the team that you formed on, what was the organization that they disbanded the engineering team, you rebuilt it?
Hybrid Theory.
Hybrid Theory, also a great Linkin Park album.
Yes, when they rebranded, everyone was like, hang on, isn't this just a Linkin Park album? It was asked in lots of meetings.
So you mentioned before about Hybrid Theory, how you had built back an engineering team from something to nothing, then nothing to something, and something great by the sounds of things. You described it as a kind of band of brothers kind of culture. I wonder, when you look back over the years, this is a question I ask everyone pretty much because it's just the most interesting to me. How do you feel your leadership style has evolved over the years, and what principles do you prioritize now?
Oh my God, that's very challenging. I think part of the problem with answering this question always is struggling to get an objective take on how your leadership has changed. It's something that I think is very difficult because you've got different people in different contexts, in different in different parts of your career that are all not incentivized to be giving you constant reviews on your leadership. Because unless you operate in a corporate culture in which has something where let's say they encourage particularly people to review up very effectively, which actually isn't very common even today. That might be considered, I'm sure if you read it in HR magazines, they're like, oh, this will be really great, let's do this. It's like, yeah, but practically people don't like reviewing their bosses, and they will tend to write obsequious reviews about them, let's be honest. Means that you also don't get any quality feedback on this. So I'm going to say right now, the caveat is, I'm just going to have to go off what it roughly feels like without a lot of external evidence about this one, which from a kind of product background makes me nervous. But nonetheless, let's talk a little bit about that. So I would say that I think that I don't know that my style has changed that much. I think Doug was a key influence in terms of making me feel like I could be really honest with people. And the moment he did that, it connected with me deeply because it felt so right. Because it was like, yeah, of course, oh my God, this is, what? I got permission to be completely honest and just find the right way to position that? Amazing. And so that was, I would say, that a big step change in terms of then doing that. So when I became a manager for the first time, really at Hybrid Theory, because I hadn't really been a manager I'd managed at the Croydon Citizen, but that was a bit different because we were all volunteers. And therefore, I have none of the leverage that traditional leaders have at all. Literally, if I tell someone, you're not doing your job properly, I'll literally just leave. Like, oh, okay, sorry.
Sorry,
please don't go, please don't go. So I had to develop in that context a super soft style because there wasn't going to be, and when I say super soft, what I really mean is it had to be entirely based on persuasion, because I don't have there is no stick here. It has to be 100% carrot. So actually, in many ways, maybe that was actually quite, thinking out loud, maybe that was actually pretty good, the volunteer role, because it forces you to manage with 100% carrot, which is always going to be a more challenging environment than if you have other tools at your disposal. So that was something that I think was very useful for teaching me that. Doug taught me the kind of value of honesty, which was, again, fairly early into the Croydon, around the time I was running the Croydon Citizen. And then at Hybrid Theory, I guess it was seeing bosses like Ray and his way of interacting with people and being both his idea of injecting enthusiasm, that just felt like it gave me even more permission to use my natural enthusiasm. It was something that I think one of the biggest compliment Doug ever gave me, which I think was one of those things that was like mostly a compliment, but because it was just an observation, maybe also not always a compliment, was that he described me. He'd recently finished reading the Walter Isaacson biography of Steve Jobs, and he described me as having something like what he called the James Naylor reality distortion field, which is this comment that was made which was originally, of course, the Steve Jobs reality distortion field, which was his uncanny ability to make people feel like things were possible that weren't otherwise possible. And I think because of my natural enthusiasm, that has a positive benefit of that. And I sort of realized I could harness that and actually use that to make people feel like, because I could, I'd done a lot of philosophy, so I could argue for anything, really. Meant that really I would just make a case for, look, honestly, no, you think this thing's impossible, but it's not impossible, and here's why. And I think that, and the funny thing about that is, if once people believe something's possible, actually, they are so much more likely to be able to actually achieve it. They still might not, but the probability that they're going to succeed is just increased dramatically. And I would say, in general, that's how I feel about management as a powerful principle I've learned, is you need to constantly make people feel like anything is possible. And that's a subtle art to that, because, and this is why it actually pairs with authenticity in a funny way that people might not fully understand, because they might think something more Billy Basic analysis would be something like, oh, but you're not being honest then about how difficult things are with people. And I'm like, well, no. We can be very honest about what a challenge it is. Right, we're going to say, okay, so we need to disrupt this massive $1 billion company. Yeah, that's going to be real hard. That's going to be insanely hard. However, look at the past. Have people done it before? Yes. Okay, so it can be done. And do we believe we have a set of skills that we can use to deploy it? We go through, let's take an honest assessment of our skills. Well, yeah, if we did all the right things, assuming we can do this, then yeah, maybe we can do that. An honest assessment of a lot of situations, it will often lead to the idea that actually, if you approach it the right way and you're prepared to put the work in, you can probably do it. If other people have done something similar in a similar domain before, or there's physics that suggests it's possible, or that you have the required expertise around, and because once people believe it to be the case here, in their heart, they then more like to do it. It's actually your ethical duty to convince them that they will be able to do it. Because by just convincing you, that you make it more probable. So again, it's like, well, actually, it's not only is it your duty to push that hard. It isn't just you could push that hard. It's your duty to. So I think from that point onwards, it made me realize that was my duty as a leader, is to make people feel like that there is an exciting future ahead of them. But always tempering that with never selling bullshit. And don't sell the fantasy version. Right? That's not about selling a fantasy version of something. It's like communicate the positive, realistic case.
And what I really like about what you're saying now is it ties into the authenticity we spoke about a bit earlier, and the importance for being honest. And I think what you're demonstrating here is a way to be honest and be factual and bring people along with you in a way which is truly leading, rather than, I don't know why I've not thought about carrot and stick in such a long time. And as you were talking about carrot and stick, I was thinking, yeah, I wonder if people that have managed me and I've managed as well, like where was the carrot and where was the stick in that relationship? But I really am really grateful for sharing some thoughts around how what did you describe? It wasn't convincing people, was it? What did you
I think that the phrase as persuasion.
Persuading people. Because you're right, and it's what a great thing. I'd love to know what the metric is on, if someone does believe they can do it, do they achieve it versus people who don't. And I'm sure that would be quite an easy test to run in your next organization. Just just have a team that you don't try and persuade they can do it. Maybe even a third team that you say, I don't think you can do it. And then a team that you say, I think you can. And then another team that you say,
just ignore.
Just go and see if you think you can do it and let me know.
Yeah.
That would be interesting.
I mean, it would be a fascinating experiment. I mean, quite abusive on your team and probably not great for your chances of success. But would it be a fascinating experiment? For sure, it'd be a very fascinating experiment.
I think even as a side, wouldn't even have to be a real company. I mean, it's the sort of thing that you could imagine like a giant Amazon or Microsoft or something like that like literally just have people thrown into the grinder every day and are like, well, that's great. We've extracted $2 worth of juice from the 20 people. Fire them.
I mean, they'd be in a great position to run these kind of experiments. That's absolutely true. Like on their staff, I think they probably do. I suspect it would be not surprising if they do that all the time, because to try to understand, if it's the greater good of understanding the best way to manage that's going to make everyone else more effective and happier, then yeah, makes sense.
So you shared a bit earlier that you had that one interview question that really stuck with you about the number of washing machines sold in the UK. Behind that question, and I think you did such a great job explaining why it's such a great question. And I think you've obviously had a lot of time to think about it. It's come back to you very quickly for the purpose of this podcast. So it's something that has stuck with you, the question at least. I wonder, because it's such a huge, it's a small question, but it's a huge thing to unpack. Do you think even just being asked that question, being put in that position to think about it, somehow changed your way of thinking or influenced your way of thinking?
For sure.
Because it's a massive question, isn't it?
For sure. It seems like on the surface, like a question about the number of washing machines that are sold sounds like that's not going to be a particularly important question. But it turns out to be, completely. Because I think what it did was, it was the first time I felt like I'd been interviewed by someone who was very interested in, or understood the value of, intellectual capacity. Which I'm sure they will always say that's the reason they're asking it. But it also requires is synthesis of existing knowledge. And that's something that I think is hugely valuable in most managerial and leadership white-collar roles. Because actually, you need to understand that. You need to better understand that. And I actually think in many ways, so I think the kind of benefit of a more old-fashioned classical education where you learn about everything is that just knowing more about the world in general is kind of important for helping you solve problems. Sometimes we have a very skills-oriented view of education, which is just like, well, as long as you've got the right skills, you can know nothing about the world, have no curiosity, you'll be fine. Incorrect. I'm pretty sure that for really difficult problem solving, the whole reason that humans are great is because we are constantly taking information from very different fields or domains and then cross-pollinating that. And actually, a lot of really good ideas they rarely come from the people who've just been in the industry all the way through, done the same thing, and are incurious. Even the people who've spent their entire lives in the industry and then innovate in it tend to be people with a huge amount of curiosity. Because where are you going to get the ideas from that are going to change things? They're not, by definition, going to be from within. And so I think it's a question that calls on that, as well as calling on critical thinking. And it calls on a bit of confidence. Because I think the people's intrinsic answers being questions like, well, I don't know, I would research it, I would ask you, I would so-and-so, is immediately an answer of someone who is kind of afraid to give their opinion and just wants to be told the answer. Whereas that's the whole point. It's not, don't get told the answer, you have to work it out for yourself. That kind of independent thinking as well is great. So independent thought, wide cross-pollination of knowledge, and proper critical thinking skills with lateral kind of elements. It's a slam dunk of a question from that perspective.
So I love what you say about the synthesis of the general and to the specific, and from one specific to another, and amazing things coming out. And of course you would say that because you're also an artist, right? So that you see those things like maybe other people don't, which is an incredible thing. As you were talking about that, it got me thinking about, okay, we learn in our formal education, but we learn through life as well. And there are the people that I like to work with generally are people who are interesting to me, and interesting people to me bring other parts of life into work with them. It doesn't mean it has to be personal, but they are people that are not just about their work or not just about that project or that task. You know, the thing I hate the most, it hasn't happened in a really long time, the thing I hate the most, especially in permanent roles, is that we go out for team drinks and everyone goes out and you just talk about the project that you're working on, or you just talk about the customer or something, something like that. Given that you're someone that already comes to problems and occasions at work in your working life with an appreciation for the general, do you make time to have outside interests beyond Naylor Games? And I'm also asking that with a kind of a frame of, you were talking before about, you know, that entrepreneurial mindset of being in the office from dawn to dusk. Doesn't mean that I think that you should, or that it's not a judgment. It's not supposed to be a judgmental question, but do you make time for things like that?
It's a really good question. I think this is one of those, there are seasons in life for different things. And I kind of feel like at the moment, and for the last 18 months, and probably for the next 3 months, I would estimate, the season is very much one that demands a huge amount of attention. Something else that happened to me recently, unfortunately, as well, is that last year I got COVID. And when I was recovering from it, I initially not only lost my sense of smell, but my sense of smell came back wrong. And, it's very, very distorted. So it is getting better now, but at its worst point in September, it was the case that anything with a strawberry scent and loads of perfumes, anything remotely perfumed personal hygiene products, smelled horrifying to me. Like disgusting, actively disgusting. A lot of foods, it's still the case that all fried foods are inedible, mostly for me to eat, because they taste disgusting to me. They have weird, and these, I would say, when people describe them, they say things like, this smelled like vomit, or it smelled like this. But actually, in reality, when you dig under the surface, these smells are like new smells I'm getting. They're not like anything else that's exists. They are completely alien, but they're often in trigger a high disgust response. Alcohol is another one. So when alcohol makes you like that, and someone having recently shampooed their hair makes you feel like, whoa, horrible. And if someone opens up a yogurt at one end of an office and you want to vomit, which is what it's been like at the worst times, you kind of... We were so busy, I took the practical decision to be like, right, well, I've got this thing. There is no known treatment for it. It's relatively rare. It takes up to between 6 months to 24 months to recover. Realistically, I'm just going to lean into the work, because this is stopping me from doing a lot of the things I would otherwise enjoy about socializing with friends anyway. So at the moment, I feel like I'm going through a season, and it is, by the way, it's getting better. It's gradually improving. There is a treatment that you can get done. I'm going to get it done again, called a stellate ganglion block, in which they inject your stellate ganglion, which is like a bundle of nerves in your neck, with powerful anesthetic. And the idea is to, and this is very weird, it is to essentially reboot your fight or flight mechanism. And it's very strange. It's been used for about 100 years for PTSD as a treatment, but is now being used for parosmia as well, because it turns out there's some people are discovering there are these really interesting connections between your sense of smell and your fight or flight parasympathetic nervous system. And so for some people who get this procedure, when they get injected, it instantly cures all the bad smells and everything goes back to smelling normal. Like completely instantaneously. Now, those are the people in the top 10% of results. In the bottom 10% of results, people get no effect whatsoever. And then most people will land in the middle like I did, where actually, to be honest, all the smells improved and my disgust response just massively went down. And for the first 2 weeks afterwards, I slept like a baby. It was incredible. It was just like the fight or flight had just been like turned off and reset back to a lower level where it was like, everything's fine. And suddenly the disgust response to everything was just like gone for a bit. So the short answer to that is I will never not stop being interested in things. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm always interested in discussing philosophy with people, talking about all kinds of issues. If you want to get me on an interesting conversation, I think I'll better deliver on it. But that is true at the moment, that outside interests are mostly work, get a minimum amount of exercise to not die, and then that's basically it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I think that your response is great as well, because I think often when I ask the question, some people have external reasons why they maybe can't go deep into a personal life, as opposed to other people who might be, if you're like 21 years old and you're like single, no children, no dependents, whatever, like make all the time in the world for personal life, or not, because you're not impacting anyone else. But when you're, as old as we are, or, growing up and you've got real things going on, then that puts that personal life in a slightly different kind of context to maybe what it was. So I hope your smell comes back, old chap. Do let me know.
Yeah. I think it will. I'm going to get the procedure done again. It was like a big leap forward, but it plateaued again. It's already the case now. I mean, that I'm no longer. It was difficult even being outdoors for a while. So that now, thankfully, is.
Yeah, because you also don't want that to become ingrained in you, right? That you're going to have that, because that's like, a whole load of mental health things are coming out with that.
Oh, yeah. And I think that's the important thing about this, to talk about it in a kind of seasonal sense as well, is that I don't think this kind of extreme work can go on forever. And I think it's actually, you look at some certain kind of business leaders. I mean, take someone like Elon Musk. He's a good example of like what extreme working all of the time is. Like when he decided to live in that little house for a while on one of the SpaceX premises. But it's like a house built for homeless people. And he's like, I like this because it minimizes the distance from the bed to the sink. And you're just like the richest man in the world. His thought process is, I would like to live in a small room as possible because that is the most efficient, right? Some people are like made for that extreme but they're the extreme outlier people. And I think anyone who's like in the bottom 99% of capacity to work endlessly, which I put myself in, even though it's probably considerably above average, you can't do this forever. So I think it's very much, like I say, a season, something I'm hoping to move on from, as we have enough people in the business that I can afford to take steps away and things don't fall apart.
So let's move into our next theme, which is mentorship, guiding, and being guided. You mentioned Doug before as a mentor and has demonstrated behaviors that you've assimilated, or at least have influenced how you understand things can be. And also you mentioned your dad, who demonstrated from the moment you were born, by the sounds of things, that entrepreneurship can deliver, it can make you happy, and you can have a family. All these things that actually, I think, maybe modern interpretations of entrepreneurship kind of push against a little bit.
The kind of Sigma grind set entrepreneurship is kind of very much like doesn't fit that mold at all.
Right. You must give up everything for the business. Can you share any memorable mentorship moments that you received through your career? Anything that springs to mind beyond the
as in ones where I've mentored other people, or situations where
you have either like received mentorship in a kind of very direct way, or again, like with the Doug example, you kind of perceived something happening. You're like, oh, this is it. This is how it should be.
I think it's very much like, as I said before, I think for me it's multiple. It's more about, if you're listening, generally good people will have multiple things to teach you. Because I think even strangers have things to teach you.
And let me ask you about that then. So I think a lot of people, when they think about mentors and mentorship and learning in general, they bring with them that classical learning of, well, learning is for learning moments, as opposed to learning is happening all the time and all around me. How do you maintain an openness to kind of receive and learn as you go through life? Or what about you do you think gives you that kind of perspective that like any moment is a moment to learn?
Well, I think probably if we were talking in psychometric terms, I would probably be very high on the openness scale in the Big Five personality instrument. So on some fundamental dispositional level, I am very, very just high openness. So in the sense that I'm very interested in what people have got to say, I'm very interested in any new idea or new insight, I'm just like gobble, gobble, gobble up. In fact, if anything, I'm a bit of a kind of information goblin who is always out there. Just like, if anything, my problem is I want to go. I'm like plugging myself up with lots more information sources. Like, scroll through this, watch this interesting video, listen to this podcast, read this article. And in the end, I'm overstimulating myself with too many new ideas. If anything, that's a problem I have. And these days, I notice I'm like, no, James, because you're dealing with like so much. You have such a big attention budget you have to pay for at work now, particularly running a service business. You can't afford to spend it all on every interesting idea that comes your way. So I think from some perspective, for me, it's very easy because my default is just, oh, that's interesting. Yes, tell me more. I would like to grab your brain and suck it dry of all knowledge. That's kind of very much my sort of supervillainous approach to things. So when someone's got something to share, I'm like, yes, feed me. That's very much how I feel. So from that perspective, it feels so natural to just want to be learning from people all the time.
I guess you mentioned a bit earlier about, I think we kind of glanced on the idea of mentorship being an important part of your life, and it's an important thing in general. I guess what are your thoughts around that? Let's go very, very vague.
Well, let's go. I'm happy to. I'll try and give you a precise answer to a vague question. So, I very much enjoy mentoring other people. I think from my perspective, passing on knowledge is equally good to receiving it from the point of view of that. And I like to. What's wonderful is seeing people grow. I think watching someone learn how they can do something, gain confidence in doing a task, getting better at it, feeling that increased sense of self-worth, that they're doing really good work. There's something wonderful about that. And I think being able to facilitate that as a mentor is brilliant. And so, if anything, a problem I have now is that sometimes there will be people we work with who I kind of want to mentor, and I have to be reminded a bit by Jira occasionally. I'm like, remember, these are customers. You can't afford to spend too much time with them. Like, don't get too obsessed with, I really want to help this person out. And it's like, yeah, but the business though. And in funny ways, that's because he's actually very similar in that sense. And he's very charitable to people. But he can see that in me, that I sometimes need to restrain me just because we just have so little time.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. So we've had a really lovely conversation. It's always good to talk to you, James. But also interesting to hear a different side to you, right? Because we've known each other kind of on and off, but mostly on, I guess, since we were 10 or something like that.
So it is 26 years at this point.
Yeah, it's wild.
More than a quarter of a century that we have known each other.
And how about that? It's taken me 26 years to work out that you're an artist. It's such a long time.
Exactly. What will you work out in the next 26 years?
Yeah, that's it. Let's come back in 26 years. We'll put it in the calendar.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, then let's move into the final theme, which is our conclusion. So, when you reflect on what we've talked about today, the James Naylor of now is very different to the James Naylor of 20 years ago or 15, 10, 5, whatever years ago, even by the sounds of things, even a couple of years ago, based on the smell.
Maybe 90 minutes ago.
How about that? I'm happy to take on all of the responsibility of having changed you in the past 90 minutes. But I wonder, we've gone into depth, right? And we've talked about a lot of things and maybe some of those things have sparked new thoughts and new ideas or new perspectives, given that you're the James Naylor of today. Has anything new kind of jumped out? Any new thoughts as a result of us today?
Yeah, I think I've not done a kind of retrospective like this on my own recent career life in a long time, in this kind of conscious way, thinking about how all the pieces fit together. And yet the future is something that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, because I think it would be fair to say that in the last 6 years, since we started Naylor Games, almost 6 years, that there have been some really tough periods. And I would say that there have been more periods of less momentum than I think I was experiencing in my career before that. And I think that's sort of inherently true when you start your own thing, and you have to be the motive force for all of it. And that means that It's also a period that included the pandemic as well. And I think to some extent, I think everyone still feels a little bit like maybe that was a bit like a life pause on some extent in many ways, because so many things slowed down. So I think that's maybe affecting my judgment a little bit too. But there is that sense, and I think the reason the last 18 months have been difficult but thrilling, and they have been hard, things like the smell problem has been so annoying, it's been nice to get that momentum back again, particularly recently, I think. And I think going through this process of buying companies and growing the business. So, and I think I had that natural sense of momentum pretty much all the way until really end of 2018, but just by itself. And it's just made me realize, thinking about that I'm like, yeah, there are like a lot more formative things were happening to me. And maybe that's just the natural process of life during those earlier years that have perhaps happened to me in more recently. But I think maybe that is just the what happens. You learn the skills and you go out into the wilderness and you use them, and you're now having the experience of battling them. And maybe I will look back on this time period and say, well, that wasn't the same as that, but it was equally valuable in a very different way.
Oh yeah, and I was going to make that point as well, because for sure, right? I mean, like, there are important things happening for you right now. So thank you so much for spending all this time with me. I guess my final question to you is, as we wrap up, is there anything that you hope that our listeners take away from our conversation today?
Oh wow, very, very difficult. I hope they found it interesting. I hope that they find something of my experience useful for them. I think that's really, really important. And I would say, if I wanted them one thing for them to take away, is that my practical experience is that it really, really benefits you to be enthusiastic. And in my experience, everywhere that I have taken my enthusiasm and engagement has always been very positive. And I think particularly in Britain, for listeners of yours that are located in the UK, I think that's a bit of a problem for us as a culture in general, is being a little bit damp on enthusiasm. And I think people will be surprised how transformative it can be.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Mentor Collective podcast. If you enjoyed it, you're welcome to subscribe. You're also welcome to go to our website, thementorcollective.net, to find out about the other good work we do in mentorship. Wherever you are, I hope you have a great rest of your day.